Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nuha Eltinay. I'm a PhD student at London South Bank University at the School of the Built Environment and Architecture, and I'm here to present part of the findings of my PhD, which is under the title of Building Urban Resilience in the Arab region context of climate change, conflict and displacement. I also represent an NGO, a regional NGO called the Arab Urban Development Institute, which is based in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, but we work across the 22 Arab countries and we help cities in assessing and building resilience. If I started to speak about the background of my research, got it. Well done. If I started to speak about my presentation today, that's going to be divided into two parts. The first part is the poster that you get to see here, and that's the poster that I've shared in one of the conferences in 2016. This poster here will speak most probably on the problem statement of my study, the background of it, but also the scope and the boundaries. Then from there, I'll move into the second part of my presentation, which will focus more on the methodology, the findings of the research, the evidence that has been based on it from primary data collection, and what are the findings that we can come up into answering my research questions. But before I come into the details of that presentation, it's obviously me in that photo. But what is interesting here, that the costume that I'm putting on in that photo 2 months ago is the same one that I'm wearing today. And the reason I'm doing that is 2 months ago, I come from Sudan. 2 months ago, the revolution in Sudan against the previous regime took a very important lead by women in my country. On that day, I was part of participants who are attending a workshop in South Korea, in Incheon, as part of the Getty Institute. There we were doing a knowledge exchange between 20 cities globally who were sharing their experiences on resilience assessments. On that day, it happened to be the Women International Day. On the same day, we had a movement back in Sudan where women were dressed up in their traditional dress, but specifically in a white color, because that's the color where women in previous revolutions in Sudan have dressed up, chanting on the streets, asking for freedom and asking for their rights. On that day, women were in prisons. The revolution did not achieve success as it did today, but we are still asking for more, and that links to resilience very significantly, and I will come into details of that when I speak about the definition of vulnerability, while speaking about political perspectives, we're speaking about urban poverty, urban disasters and urban violence, and the context of the fragile city. Now, this also relates into a very strong tool that I'm using in that research. I'm looking into how do we assess resilience in the Arab region. But the question that I'm asking here is using a tool that is initiated by the UN office, UNDRR. At that time, it was the UNISDR. Here what you see is what we call the old 10 essentials that were framed based on the Hyogo Framework. Following the old 10 essentials, I was interestingly in 2015, and that what triggered the background of my research and gave me the motivation to take this PhD forward. In 2015, at the upper floor, we had a very interesting expert groups meeting where experts from all over the world were gathering to move from the old 10 essential and develop what we call the new 10 essentials that you see here and you are mostly aware of. But the interesting story here, that at that time I was the only representative from the Arab region, and looking into the feedback and the knowledge that are gained by the experts in the room, it was completely overwhelming. That gave me a very, very, I would say, responsibility on understanding what is resilience in the context of the Arab region, representing the Arab Urban Development Institute, but most importantly, how am I going to go back home and transfer that knowledge into city leaders who are really challenged with with huge responsibilities of refugees. When I speak about refugees, it's very important that we carry along the history of our region. The crisis in the region started from the Palestinian crisis at a very early stage, and it's still ongoing now. We are speaking about 70 plus years, and this is escalated by wars going on and on in different parts of the world. Recently, the Syrian crisis, but we should not also forget what we call the unforgotten wars, the Darfur War and other wars. Why am I mentioning that dimension? Because if we did not consider the impact of conflict and violence in our region, then we cannot consider displacement. And if we did not count the movement and the secondary displacement in our rural and most importantly urban context, when a disaster happens in such context, then it's very difficult for us to come up with accurate figures in order to speak about disaster data losses that automatically reports into the Sendai National Monitoring System in order to achieve our Sendai targets. So this is the scope of my research, and it's going to be limited to the Arab region, focusing on the IDPs and predominantly on the refugees crisis as well. Now, looking very briefly into the background of the research, if I look into climate change is a global problem. So it's not very specific into one country or one region in our world. The disaster impact of climate change on urban livelihoods and natural biodiversity systems has long been observed worldwide. But if we look into the underlying risks of urbanization, environmental degradation, socioeconomic inequality, poor urban governance, this is what makes our region special. Because if we do not have, for the local government specifically, the adaptive and absorptive capacities to deal with those risks and be able to accommodate the displacement crisis, here is where the disaster losses increases and problems escalate. And as we look into the challenges of the local governments, we need to look into how that cycle moves. So when a disaster happens, and climate change takes place, it's displacement. So people start moving from one location to the other. Having said that, it's not as straightforward because people do move from if we look into the urban or the global observatories who work on that specific field of monitoring displacement, movements from urban to rural context more or less can be, I won't say completely controlled, because there is a lot of processes of registration. We're looking into refugees in camps and informal settlements, but still it can be managed in compared to secondary displacement that is taking place in urban context. And I will come into that in details when we speak about facts and figures. But that displacement, once people move to one place to the other, that means that the competition for resources is increasing. And with the lack and the deficiency of resources that we have, that might trigger conflict. And conflict is not, it can be take various ways, but violent conflict is mostly what we get to see in that part of our region. But if we just stop there and move into who are the first respondents when a conflict happens, is humanitarian aid agencies. They take a lot of the burden, but that does not mean that is really helping us to build resilience, because there is a huge gap between humanitarian aid and development. We always speak about that nexus and how are we going to fill the gap between the two areas. So it's very important that we recognize here that the aid or the finance for the aid needs to be shifted. We need to come up with new models for financing and looking into how development is taking place within the cities and feed into that. Facts and figures. What you see here is a number, 31.1 million in 2016. What I want to highlight here that the recent Internal Displacement Monitoring Center report for 2019 have come up with a lower figure, which is 28 million. This is combining both conflict and disasters. Although the number is lower, that does not mean that the challenges or the problems are solved. The number is getting lower. If you come into the disaggregated level or looking into the data in details, what you would notice that the numbers are being reduced in conflict context, for example, because the Syrian war kind of settled. We're looking into issues that have been taking place in Iraq and other parts of the world that have been resolved, but internal displacement have not stopped. And that's where the humanitarian aid gap comes in. The humanitarian aid feeds in after the crisis immediately, but it does not look into the long-term impact. So once a crisis is being settled, agencies are moving into other projects and finances are being shifted. But what happened to the people who have moved from one place to the others? Did they come up with what we call durable solutions for their settlements? Are they in safe areas and safe places for them to settle, or are they again moving into what we call a secondary displacement or protected displacement that is not part of those facts and figures? So it's very important that we consider that those numbers are guiding, but they are not final. So again, more facts and figures here to be highlighted, but I think the most important part that I would like to come into is asking that question: how can we really, with those challenges, assess and build resilience in disaster, conflict and fragile settings? If we are taking the normal approach that is followed by the international frameworks, we always speak about monitoring hazards, reducing the level of exposure in order to reduce the impact and the level of vulnerability or for the most vulnerable groups. As I mentioned, I'm focusing here on IDPs and refugees, but we do know that there are other vulnerable groups that needs to be considered as well. But speaking about vulnerability as a dimension, the complexity of the vulnerability, the change of the vulnerability across time is something that really need to be considered, because in the Arab region alone, hosting 5 of the world's 12 countries, there is the highest overall risk of humanitarian crisis and disasters. The Arab region hosts the countries of Sudan, Somalia, Syria and Yemen. Those countries falls into the highest values of global vulnerability, and that's by the Inform Index in 2018. What are the international agreements doing here? If we do not move with the monitoring of international agreements from the national to the local level, we cannot build resilience at the local level in fragile context. The Habitat 3 New Urban Agenda. Here I'm trying to come up with, in my research to come up with a model and look into how the development of those agreements is taking place and the link of the different indicators. But again, this is a gap that needs to be strongly identified by national governments, local governments and the global community. Coming into the end of my research, I would like to highlight a very interesting projects that help a lot for me to understand the practical principles of resilience building, not only the theoretical part of it. Here, a disaster resilience assessment that applied the new 10 essentials, the scorecard for the UNDRR, in collaboration with a great colleague who's attending here with us today, Mark Harvey, and Resurgence. What we have done here, resilience assessment took place in 25 Arab cities among countries in the Arab region. That process of resilience assessment I get to learn from it, and that feeds a lot into the research finding that it's not about the numbers or the indices that we reach, it's about the process. Asking ourselves the questions: who are the stakeholders engaged in that process? In what level are they engaged? What is their mandate? Are they actually feeding back on those resilience assessments back to their organization and institutional governments? Is that feedback just limited to the local level, or is it going upper into the national level to really have that challenge of policy and moving from Sendai just being a soft law into hard laws that are linking into human rights and other very strong elements that needs to be considered when we speak about resilience for local communities. So from those observations, again, I want to emphasize more on the lack of availability and accountability when it comes into data. That is to be considered, because IDPs are part of those communities. One of the solutions proposed, but not the only one, open data, that we need also to consider the data that is generated by those people who are moving from one place to the other, but we need to overcome the politics of sharing data between the different organizations, humanitarian aid agencies, national governments feeding back into those global observatories on having accurate measures, facts and figures on the numbers of people who are moving, the conditions of their movement, when we say voluntary return, the word voluntary need to really be questioned, because in some conditions they do not have other options, and we don't know that that return is actually into a safer place. And here I will come into concluding about stakeholders. I think it's very, very important that we consider the Sendai Framework structure of the stakeholders, but what we don't consider here is what we call informal actors, people who are working on the ground with the IDPs, people who are managing refugees camps, people who are not in the bigger picture or the political agenda, but they do support these people on a daily basis, and they are the key at providing us with key access to the most vulnerable people on those fragile contexts. From here, this is the final outline of the linkages between the national and the 10 essentials, linking them into the Sendai national monitoring targets, and also, more importantly, that we don't rely on one tool or one framework, because none of those frameworks are perfect. Any of them have those pros and cons, and local governments are the best, I would say, users of those tools. They have to combine between them, come up with coherent measures. As long as we are asking for coherence at the national level, we also need to consider coherence with the use of the tools at the local level to come up with effective and efficient resilience action plans. Collect data, share it, use it, in order to build sustainability for resilient cities and community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuha. And any quick questions from Nuha, from the audience? Okay, we have somebody here.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation very much. Could you give me a reason why everything you presented in terms of the Arab world would not be exportable or applicable in the world outside the Arab world?
Why it won't be? Actually, it does. It can be. But the reason I am focusing on the Arab region is I'm looking into the highest level. When I've mentioned the Inform Index, the 2018 Inform Index. Across all over the world, it's the only region that have the highest number of countries compared to the other regions across the world, and that's where the scope of the research is. But this is also one of the boundaries. So the lessons learned here can definitely be replicated in other parts. So I've already been looking into case studies in Southeast Asia. I'm looking into the Americans as well, because when you speak about urban violence, it comes with all shapes and types.
Okay, so we have one more.
Thank you, Nuha, for your good presentation. I want to ask you about exposure and vulnerability models. Do you think that if we will have in micro scale, not in macro scale, this will be helpful for your study to be more accurate in?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the gaps that I've been looking into when I have done the assessment of the existing frameworks, that we have a separation between vulnerability assessments, which are community-based, looking into grassroots level, and resilience assessment, which the focus group here is local governments. So that institutional gap between the communities and the local governments needs to be filled as much as we need to fill the gap between local and national levels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more, please.
Very quickly, Nuha, I congratulate you on the most brilliant presentation. But thank you for making sure that Sendai does not forget conflict, which I think is such a frightening issue that you've been describing, and the IDP consequences. Your courage in doing this is remarkable. Please continue.
Thank you, Virginia. I just want to mention that I'm really honored to have you on board, carrying along that process. Not only today, Virginia have been the inspiration to my PhD research, my external supervisor, but always the helping hand that I can reach to. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you all for listening.